All right. We're picking up in Luke chapter 23. I said I would love to do this, to finish this study in 30 weeks, and we're on week 28. And we're not even finishing chapter 23. So I don't know what that means for the rest of the study. But if you remember, we kind of split the trial of Jesus in half. So Jesus he first appears before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish religious court, and they find him guilty, wrongfully so, of blasphemy, but they don't actually have the authority to put him to death. So they send him to Pilate, who is the Roman governor of Judea, because he does have that power. Well, the first time he's with Pilate doesn't really find anything, doesn't find Jesus guilty, doesn't find anything really worthy of any punishment, certainly not death. And then Pilate finds out that Jesus is a Galilean. Not only is he from Galilee, but his ministry and, the whole reason why this trial is happening, right, because of all the claims that Jesus is making, all the stuff that Jesus has done, started in Galilee. And so they send him to Herod, and that's where we're picking up in verse 8. I'm going to scoot closer because there's no one at this table, so I feel like I'm half a mile away from everyone. I want to feel like a family. Okay, so verse 8 of chapter 23. When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied or berated him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him." But the whole crowd shouted, "Away with this man! Release Barabbas to us!" Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" For the third time he spoke to them, "Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him." But with loud shouts they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. So, talked about this last week a little bit, but remember all that's going on here in the book of Luke, both sort of from two perspectives, right? First, as just a book or as a story, and then second, as an account of divine history, right? Luke as an author, just as a writer, he has mastered the art of the setup and payoff, right? All of these characters that he introduced very early on in chapters 3 and 4, Annas, Caiaphas, Pilate, Satan, and even Herod, as we'll talk about, they all appear early on in the book. They're all set up, and then now is the payoff. Satan, we're told, he exited the scene in chapter 4, but we were told, right, sort of like the cliffhanger to a movie, right? I'll be back, right? That was from the Terminator or whatever, right? We were told that Satan would return at an opportune time. And Luke, the author, has made it pretty clear that that opportune time has arrived. In the very end of chapter 22, well, not the very end, but in 22:53, Jesus says, "This is your hour when darkness reigns," right? So all these characters that were set up by Luke now make their reappearance in, again, just thinking about this as like a book or a story, the final act, right? They've all made their reappearance in the final act as the antagonists to not only Jesus, but to the divine plan of redemption, right? So you can see that, there is sort of the storytelling Luke, and then the under divine inspiration from the Holy Spirit Luke, and both of those are not working against each other at all. But as we know, there's one more character that was set up early on in Luke, which now reappears here in chapter 23, and we've discussed him before. He is Herod, or Herod Antipas, or Herod the Tetrarch, right? We first see mention of him in chapter 3, surprise, surprise, because everyone else was brought up in chapter 3 as well. And this is what we said about him when we talked about him in chapter 3. The title Tetrarch means, literally translated out, ruler of a fourth or ruler of a quarter. So, you have the Herod from Jesus' birth, Herod the Great. That guy died in 4 BC. So he died and he split his kingdom 4 ways. Now, by the time you get to Jesus, it gets weird because, 2 of those descendants or people that inherited part of the kingdom had died off, and then part of the territory was being governed directly by Rome. So that's Pilate is not a tetrarch, he's just the governor of Judea. So it gets kind of weird by the time you get to, AD, whatever we're at now with, Jesus's ministry and death. But originally Herod the Great died in 4 BC. He split the kingdom 4 ways. Herod, again, Antipas, he was given the term Herod Tetrarch, and he ruled over, this is your first blank, the Galilee region. All right. Thus, Pilate's decision in verse 7, right before we picked up, when Pilate learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time, right? So Herod Antipas was ruler over the Galilee region, and Herod also made a brief appearance. Well, technically, he made 2 other appearances. One of them I'm not really going to talk about, but I guess I'll mention it. The last time, technically, that we have mention of Herod is in, I think it's 13, where Jesus is told by someone else that Herod wants to kill him. Now, obviously, by the time we get to chapter 23, something has changed, and Herod is a lot more interested in Jesus and wants to see Jesus perform a miracle than just straight up wanting to kill him. And obviously, Herod would have been able to kill him, but he didn't. So something changed between, I think it was chapter 13 and now. But really, the last time we saw Herod in any detail was in chapter 9. Now, what's interesting about chapter 9 is that that's where we have, I'll just read. This is verses 7, 8, 9 of chapter 9. It says, Herod the Tetrarch heard all about what was going on with Jesus, and he was perplexed because some were saying that John the Baptist had risen from the dead, others that Elijah had reappeared, and still others that one of the prophets of long ago had come back to life. But Herod said, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. All right. So again, if you look at it from a storytelling perspective, or just like a book perspective, right? By name dropping Pilate, Herod, Annas, Caiaphas, Satan, early on in the book, Luke is sort of setting up once again this climax, this final showdown. Not only of, the Roman government and the Jewish leaders versus Jesus, but again, good and evil, light and darkness, the salvation of mankind is what's at stake, right? Because, you look at it from the perspective of a book, and it's obviously very well written, but as we understand the Bible, it's not just a book, it's an account of divine history. And so you see sort of those 2 ways to look at Luke, I guess the human authorship and the divine authorship, I guess is how some people would put it. And, they're not working at odds against each other at all. They come together. And so I'll get on to your next blank. But it says, all of our antagonists, right, quote unquote, they all come together in Jerusalem, even Herod, who was not ruler over Jerusalem, right? Herod was over the Galilee region. They all come together in Jerusalem, and influencing all of them was Satan, right? Now here's your blank. Now that the Jewish religious leaders, the Roman political leaders, and the Herodian ruler, which if you don't remember that, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. Go back to week 1. We talked about it. Kind of partially Jewish, kind of partially not. You have the Jewish religious leaders, the Roman political leaders, and the Herodian ruler, who in some ways represented both Jewish rule and Roman rule. They were all present in Jerusalem at the same time, right? And we're told that, right, the ruler of this world, Satan's opportune time had arrived. Why? Well, in part because, again, all of these people were in the same place, and all of these people played a part in opposing Jesus, opposing redemptive history, and, right, leading up to this climax of the book and of divine history, right? So, now, all of that out of the way, let's actually talk about Jesus' trial before Herod. I mean, we're not exactly given a whole lot to work off of here. It's not nearly as long as the account of Jesus before Pilate. But, again, the last time we saw Herod in chapter 9, it said, because Herod didn't know who Jesus was, he said, well, I know I killed John, so it's not John, and I'm pretty sure it's not another prophet that's come back to life. I want to figure out who this guy is. The last thing we're told in chapter 9 is that Herod tried to see Jesus. Well, now in chapter 23, right, what are we told? It says, for a long time, Herod had been wanting to see him, had been wanting to see Jesus, right? And from what Herod had heard about Jesus, he hoped to see him perform some sort of miracle, we're told in verse 8, right? And remember, right, all the things that Herod had heard about Jesus from, different people, from the crowds of people. And it's the same thing that it's the same thing the disciples ask in response to Jesus' initial question. Because when Jesus initially asked his disciples about his identity, he doesn't start off with, well, who do you say that I am? What does he say? The first question he asks is, who do people say that I am? Right? And what Jesus' disciples answer is the same thing that Herod was told, right? Well, he's the reincarnation of John the Baptist. He's the reincarnation of Elijah. He's the reincarnation of some other older prophet, right? And once again, here in chapter 23, before Herod, Jesus doesn't answer any of Herod's questions, right? And I mean, that's nothing new. We talked about that last week. But, why is that? Well, number one, above all, the plan of redemption has to come to pass, right? Jesus obviously does not admit guilt. That's not what Jesus is doing. It's not that Jesus is guilty and so he just doesn't say anything at all. But he's not about to bypass the cross either. He's not about to defend his innocence and bypass the cross because, again, it's all built into redemption history. This has to come to pass, right? Also, like we talked about, with the Sanhedrin's questions, when Jesus was before the Sanhedrin, Jesus likely had a problem with the intention behind the question. Same thing when the first time Jesus was before Pilate, and Jesus remained silent. He didn't answer, or he kind of did, but in a vague way. And again, it was likely because of the intention behind Pilate's question. And just as a way of recap, right, the Sanhedrin, they were asking, are you the Messiah and are you the Son of God? Well, they were hardly asking Jesus that from a neutral perspective, right? It's not like, hopefully anyway, I guess emphasis on the hopefully, if you go to trial for something and, you're being, questioned, cross-examined, whatever, hopefully, when they're asking you questions, where were you on the night of June 3rd, 2026, right? Like, hopefully they're asking you that, not already in their mind going, well, we know that this person's guilty, right? Now, I mean, the reality is pretty much every trial operates that way because we live in a fallen world, right? But in an ideal world, that wouldn't happen, right? It's the intentionality behind it, right? How can the Sanhedrin claim to fairly judge Jesus if they've already made up his mind that he isn't the Messiah and he isn't the Son of God, right? Now, as for Pilate, Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And here we have different uses of the same phrase. Because when Pilate asked it, he clearly means it politically, right? Are you going to, I guess to kind of get ahead of ourselves and talk about Barabbas, right? Because he was an insurrectionist. Are you going to overthrow the Roman government, right? Are you going to cause a political stir and declare yourself to be, a political king in opposition to me, in opposition to Caesar, in opposition to all of Rome, right? Obviously not, right? Now, one day Jesus will come, reign physically on earth. We all know that. First time around, not the case, right? So Jesus answering yes would have been kind of pointless, because Jesus could have answered yes, and that would have been true, because Jesus is king of the Jews, just like he's king of the world. He's king of the universe, right? But when Pilate was asking that question, he didn't mean it theologically like we understand it. He meant it very humanistic terms. So Jesus remained silent. Well, it's probably the same case for Herod, right? We're not exactly told what Herod's questions are. We're not given an example of what Herod's questions are. We're told he plied, or, just piled on the questions, berated Jesus with questions. But Jesus gave him no answer, right? And again, here's your next blank. Jesus likely, again, refused to answer due to the intent behind them, right? Because what are we told here in verse 8? Herod wanted to see him perform a sign, right? He wanted to get a miracle for himself. Well, we've kind of already run into this before in Luke, and you'll also see this in Acts. So, if we ever make it out of Luke and get to Acts, we'll talk about this. But Jesus, or really any sort of spiritual power, even if it's from an apostle or whatever, Jesus is not a magician that you can just pay money to see, right? He's not a genie in a bottle. His miracles aren't on tap, right? And so I think, Herod probably didn't want to see Jesus from a completely neutral perspective. He probably just thought it would be amusing to see a miracle, right? All these other people say that you did new miracles. Why don't you do one for me, right? Be my own little, genie in a bottle type thing. Here's your next blank. Isaiah 53, verse 7. Isaiah 53, 7 actually foreshadowed this event. And this is that verse. It says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." We've all probably heard that before. It's a pretty famous verse. So, we kind of get through with Herod, and once again, Jesus is sent back to Pilate. Now, your next blank. Though Herod mocked Jesus, he actually found Jesus innocent. We're told that verse 11, both Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Jesus, and they put him in a robe and sent him back to Pilate. But you get to verse 16. No, sorry. Let me back up to 14. Pilate speaking, "You brought this man as one who is inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod," right? "For he has sent him back to me." For he has sent him back to us, sorry. So, by sending him back to Pilate, that's basically Herod's way of saying, yeah, I find this man innocent. I don't have any reason to, because here's the thing. If Herod actually had a reason to punish Jesus, he probably could have just done it himself, right? I'm not entirely sure about, because again, it's kind of weird where Herod doesn't 100% he's not like a full Roman like Pilate, but obviously Rome allows him to rule. So what is the extent of Herod's power? What is it? I'm not entirely sure. But Herod could have punished Jesus himself. He did not need to send him back to Pilate. And so by sending him back to Pilate, that's not him saying, this guy's guilty and I want Pilate to deal with it. That's his way of saying, this guy's innocent and I don't have anything to do with him. Right? So there you go. But we are told in verse 16, Pilate says he will punish Jesus and then release him. So even though both Pilate and Herod have said, yeah, this guy's completely innocent, we don't have anything on this guy, Pilate still says, well, I'm going to punish him anyway and then release him back to you. And from one of my commentaries, it says that this was probably Pilate's attempt at quelling the Jewish leaders, since this is a quote, no one can tell whether Jesus might have been guilty of some lesser offense, right? That was probably what was going on in Pilate's head, right? In other words, right, this man has done nothing worthy of the death penalty, causing a stir amongst Jews in the eyes of the Roman, like that's not a reason to put this guy to death. But Pilate is basically saying, okay, I'll appease you, I'll appease the crowd, and I'll beat him, I'll rough him up a little bit, since he's clearly done something to upset you people, and, he probably has broken some lesser rule of the Jews. Again, Pilate thinking this. He's not done anything deserving of death. He's clearly upset you. Maybe he broke some lesser rule, and so I'll beat him and then just release him. And that will appease the crowd. This is all probably what's going on in Pilate's mind. Verse 17. I'm in the NIV. We don't have a verse 17. And that's not because of the conspiracy theorists saying that they're ripping out verses from the Bible. The earliest text of Luke that we have don't have a verse 17 as we would come to label verses. They likely supplied it from Matthew and Mark's account, right? So Luke originally did not have, and I'll just read Matthew 27:15. This is the only thing you're missing. It just says, now it was the governor's custom at the festival to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd, right? So it's just giving very little background information before you jump into 18, where they start shouting, release Barabbas to us. It's explaining why they're doing that. But in any case, very likely, right, Luke's gospel did not originally include that explanatory verse. It's being copied throughout the centuries. Somewhere along the line, people say, hey, Matthew and Mark both include this explanation, and now we're so far removed from the Roman Empire and Passover being celebrated at the temple and all of this, we probably need to include this in Luke as well so people understand what this is about. That's really all there is to it. It's not that big of a deal. But what is interesting is Barabbas himself, right? The crowd wanted to release a man named Barabbas. You get that again from verse 18. And Luke, gotta hand it to him, he's so kind as to even tell us what Barabbas did to become imprisoned. Verse 19, Barabbas had been thrown in prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder, right? And again, I understand that, it had to be this way. Jesus had to die. I understand that. I understand that there's so much political tension right now in the context of Luke, going on. There's a lot of religious tension going on and all of that. I understand that. Regardless, I find it so funny in a ironic sense that they want to kill Jesus when Herod and Pilate said this man has done nothing wrong, he's done nothing to deserve the death penalty. Meanwhile, they have someone who tried to overthrow the Roman government and murdered at least one dude, probably more than that. And they said, no, release him, but put Jesus to death, right? I mean, it is, in an irony sort of sense, funny, I guess. And if you'll notice, right, you go to verse 20, the people are shouting, release Barabbas, release Barabbas. Verse 20, wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again. So Pilate, again, this man's done nothing wrong. I cleared him, Herod cleared him, right? he says, I'll appease you, I'll work with you, I'll beat him, and then release him. That's not enough. They say, release Barabbas, release the murderer, right? It's your custom every Passover, you release a prisoner. Give us Barabbas and kill Jesus instead. Pilate doesn't want to do it. He's incredibly reluctant to, and he's pleading with the people, right, several times. But the Jewish crowds, right, they're shouting more and more, and we're eventually told that, verse 24, Pilate decided to grant their demand, and he handed Jesus over to them. Well, not over to them. I mean, he just handed him over to be crucified. And here's the thing, right? The Jewish crowds should have wanted Barabbas to be free, because Barabbas is trying to overthrow, or was trying to overthrow Rome, right? He was sort of a extreme example of Jewish nationalism, right? We need to have our own nation ruled by our own people, independent of Rome. And that's what Barabbas was essentially trying to do. So the Jews should have wanted, Barabbas to be freed for that reason, right? Because, he's one of us and he's advancing our cause, right? Yet, the Jews, this is your blank. It says, their hatred for Jesus outweighs their hatred for Rome at this point. Their hatred for Jesus outweighs their hatred of Rome at this point, right? And this is a quote. It says, another interesting point is the choice becomes between something sponsored by Pilate and something sponsored by their own leaders, right? So you have, let me try to explain this. I don't know, I didn't type this out the way that I wanted to phrase it. So you have Pilate, who wants to release Jesus. The crowd wants to release Barabbas and put Jesus to death. And obviously, Rome would not want Barabbas to be freed because he tried to start an insurrection and kick out Rome, right? But their hatred, the Jews' hatred of Rome is outweighed by their hatred of Jesus. I don't think that I phrased that the way that I wanted to, but in any case, hopefully you can see what I'm saying. I type things out and they sound better in my head. But in any case, right, basically what they're saying is, right, if we accept Barabbas, then we're accepting a deal with Rome. Now, they eventually did accept Barabbas, and they allowed him to, they cheered for him to be freed and crucify Jesus. But the main point was, right, they didn't really want to broker a deal with Pilate. They didn't really want to broker a deal with Rome because that would be seen as cooperating with the enemy. I think that's what I was getting at. Luke 23, verse 26, the actual crucifixion. Verse 26, as the soldiers led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people followed him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? Two other men, both criminals. Sorry, we're ending there. We're stopping there. Verse 31. Okay. So there's two main things in this section that are happening. First, you have the mention of Simon from Cyrene. and he helps carry Jesus' cross. Then you have Jesus's, comforting, I guess, not really so comforting words to the women who were watching him. So Simon of Cyrene, right? Despite the way it can kind of sound with the way it's worded, Simon did not carry the cross the entire way to the crucifixion site. John doesn't mention Simon at all, and it says Jesus carried his own cross out to the place of the skull, Golgotha. John 19:17. So, it's probably Jesus carried it part of the way, and then they got Simon, or they both carried it, the whole way, something along that. But in any case, here's your blank. Luke does not record Jesus being beaten by Pilate, but Jesus was likely too weak to carry his own cross, which was the standard practice at the time. If you're a condemned man to die by crucifixion, you're going to carry your own cross. But, your next blank, a condemned man would only carry the crossbeam, not the entire cross. So, if you see different movies like The Passion of the Christ or something, they often have Jesus carrying, the crossbeam and then the part that would actually go on the ground. Not really historically accurate, right? I'm not saying it never happened, but the tradition, this is coming from biblicalarchaeology.org, the Biblical Archaeology Society. They're actually referencing Josephus, who wrote about Rome and crucifixions, but also they did their own archaeological studies with, the bones of people who had been crucified and all of that stuff. Really interesting, but it says, as Josephus noted, wood was so scarce in Jerusalem during the first century that the Romans were forced to travel 10 miles from Jerusalem to secure lumber for their siege machinery, right? So, you don't want to, every new person you kill gets his own entire log of wood, to himself. So, the part that stuck in the ground was always in the ground, and that would be reused for multiple crucifixions, right? What changed was, and even then it was often reused, I think. I don't think it was an entirely different one. But what you actually carried and what wasn't permanently in the ground was the crossbeam, and that would be what the prisoners actually carried. And that is probably what both Simon and Jesus were carrying. Now, it's still obviously going to be very heavy. It's, and especially, again, Luke doesn't record the beating of Jesus, but we know Jesus was beaten. So, even a healthy, fit guy would struggle carrying this. Now imagine having to carry it after having just been beaten, right? Now, Jesus' remarks to the women, starting in verse, verse 28, really. There's a large crowd of women who are mourning and wailing him, right? So not everyone in the crowd wanted to kill Jesus, right? That's something. But we've seen language like this before, even in Luke, right? Luke 21:23, how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. This is your blank. This was a prophecy of Jerusalem's fall in 70 AD, right? Luke 21:23 was a prophecy of Jerusalem's fall in 70 AD. We talked about that a few weeks back. Still in Luke 23, Jesus says to the women, blessed are the childless women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. He also goes on to say, people will say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Now, this is reminiscent of, should be on here, Hosea chapter 10, verse 8, and this describes the fall of Israel to Assyria in 722 BC. So you have Jesus kind of quoting himself, I guess, from 2 chapters ago, referencing the future destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Then you have Jesus quoting Hosea, prophesying the, what now in Luke is distant past, destruction of Samaria, northern kingdom of Israel, in 722 BC, right? One other thing is Zechariah chapter 12, and I'll go ahead and give you the blank for that. It's about the Messianic age, or the age of the Messiah. But Zechariah 12, verse 10 says, "They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one who mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." Right? So, that's not directly quoted here in Luke 23, but it's similar. So take that, take the reference back to Luke 21, and the reference back to Hosea chapter 10, put it all together, all right? It's pretty much agreed upon that Zechariah chapter 12 is talking about the Messiah. The pierced one that they're looking on and mourning is the Messiah. Sources outside of the Bible, right, attribute it to the Messiah. John's gospel and the book of Revelation, which was also written by John, interpret the pierced one as Jesus. So if Zechariah 12 is messianic, it's not talking about, it's not only or specifically talking about, the destruction of Israel's enemies or Judah's enemies, I guess, for Zechariah, nor is it talking about, the book of Revelation type stuff. It's talking about punishment for rejecting the Messiah in, the first century AD. So the description of judgment, you have it in chapter 10. Or chapter 12, excuse me. It's amplified in chapter 14. That's where you get fun stuff like people's faces melting off. That's a fun chapter to read. You have this description of judgment, and it's all in relation to Jesus as the pierced one. It's all in relation to the crucifixion of Jesus, rejecting Jesus, putting Jesus to death, all of this, right? So you see, the Old Testament prophesied not only Jesus' birth, his life, his death, his resurrection, it also prophesied the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction, or not the total destruction, but judgment on the Roman Empire, right? You see that in the Old Testament. You see the New Testament, Jesus himself prophesies the fall of Jerusalem and judgment on the Roman Empire, right? And then you also have sort of this typology between the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC and the soon coming destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, right? So this is your blank. Jesus is pretty clearly prophesying the coming destruction of Jerusalem and identifies its cause. In other words, what's causing the destruction of Jerusalem as happening right in front of them, right? Jerusalem and the Roman Empire would be judged on account of how they treated Jesus, right? Now, are the women who are grieving and in shock going to understand this? Probably not, but we can, right? Weeping over Jesus, and Jesus says, there's coming soon a time when, you're going to, say, blessed are the women that don't have children. Why? Well, because the children are going to die. The children are going to starve. We talked about all that, right? People are going to, want the hills, the high places to fall on them, right? What usually provides protection, the only comfort it can give these people will be death, right? And Jesus is basically saying what's happening right now is going to be the cause of that. So when it happens, remember back to this event. All right. Finishing up, right, verse 32. Wrong chapter. Verse 32. 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them. They do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the king of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answers him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So, First thing, Jesus' statement in verse 34 when he says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. That's one of those verses, you remember it more in the King James. They know not what they do, right? It just, I don't know. You hear it that way so many times, it gets stuck in your head. This verse is actually interesting, I think. If you go back up to verse 31, which we read, but we didn't really talk about. Jesus saying to the women, if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? We don't know what this is referring to. No one really does. It's some sort of Jewish idiom, figure of speech, but no one really knows what the exact meaning is. And, you can read a book or a commentary or a study Bible maybe, and there'll be different options. And, who is basically going to be, who is this referring to, who's going to be facing judgment, all of that, we don't really know. It's not exactly clear. That's, just as a figure of speech in English would be lost if you try to translate it in another language, it's the same case when you translate it into English. But one of the potential interpretations for the idiom is, this is a quote, if God has not spared his innocent son from the crucifixion, how much worse will it be for a sinful nation when God unleashes his righteous wrath upon it by allowing Jerusalem to be destroyed, right? If God allowed the crucifixion and the death of his own son and didn't prevent that, how much more is he not going to prevent the destruction of Jerusalem, right? Again, one of the potential interpretations, we don't really know, makes sense anyway, right? But so keep that in mind. Jesus had just said, right? Again, if that's sort of how you interpret that idiom, right? The Father's not sparing his only son, how much more will he not spare you who killed him? Now in verse 34, he's saying, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing, right? Kind of interesting. And again, if you go back to what we just talked about with, the prophecies and the typologies and all that stuff that predicts the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, this is your blank. Just as sure as Jesus' death was prophesied and set in stone, so too was Jerusalem's destruction. It was prophesied, it was set in stone, right? So then that kind of brings up the question, well, why would Jesus bother asking the Father to forgive these people, right? Like, it's not like it's not going to happen. It's not like, forgive them, they don't know what they do, and then, God will say, okay, well, I guess I won't destroy Jerusalem now because the people didn't know what they were doing, right? But, I think it's pretty obvious that, especially for the original audience, the first people that would have received this letter, they're probably going to understand this a lot more practically, application-based than theologically, right? Here's another quote. It says, for Luke's readers, it would have been easier to love their enemies with this example. The love of one's enemies, to which the readers of Luke are called, would always pale in comparison to what Jesus says here, right? So, here's your blank. Jesus forgave the ones who crucified him, regardless of whether they were ever forgiven and saved in an eternal sense by the Father. That's a mouthful. Jesus forgave the ones who crucified him, regardless of whether they were ever forgiven and saved in an eternal sense by the Father. When Jesus says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing, right? One, he's setting the example, right? He's about to not be with them anymore. He's going to die, rise again, and ascend to heaven. Here's one last example. All this whole, love your enemy, pray for them, all this stuff I've been talking about for the last 3 years. Here's one last example of that. And then two, it's probably more showing Jesus' own forgiveness than some sort of theological, well, God the Father is not counting this against the Jews or against Rome. That's probably less the point and more Jesus is forgiving them. But in any case, The next few verses, the last few verses we read, they describe the different taunts and mockery. You have the crowd, the soldiers, even one of the criminals, right? And they're mocking Jesus, and it sort of goes along perfectly with what Jesus just said, because he just said, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. And then what do they start doing? They start mocking Jesus. So, kind of goes along perfectly with that. But in the face of all of this, Jesus forgave them. And one of the criminals was more perceptive than the others, right? Not only did he criticize his fellow criminal, he even acknowledged, verse 41, Jesus has done nothing wrong, right? I heard this. This was not from a sermon, not from a commentary, right? This was just a movie or something. But, you had the thief that mocked Jesus, and you had the repentant thief. And they called the one the good thief and the other the jerk thief, right? And that was just funny. It stuck with me all these years, right? But you have the jerk thief, and he says, let me find it. Verse, where is it? 39. Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us, right? And yeah, don't have to know Greek to know he's not really asking to be saved. He's making fun of Jesus, right? In the same way that, you go back up to verse 35, the people stood watching, the rulers sneered at him, they said, he saved others, let him save himself, right? Again, they're all mocking Jesus, but this one, he's more perceptive than the others, but you're blank. For as perceptive as the criminal was, he misunderstood. He misunderstood something about Jesus, right? Multiple different commentaries that I read, they all point out that the criminal's request, verse 42, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, right? His request was likely, what he had in his mind was sort of Jesus reigning in heaven with the Father, right? Which we know Jesus died, he rose again, he ascended to the Father where he reigns right now, right? So that's probably what the thief meant, right? When you enter your kingdom, right? When you enter your spiritual kingdom, or maybe he did have in his head physical kingdom, but in other words, right? When you enter your kingdom, remember me and basically pardon me like a king would, right? That's probably what this person meant. What he misunderstood, what he got wrong, however, Jesus sets the record straight. Your last blank. Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. That's ripped straight from verse 43, right? Jesus sort of entered his kingdom, I guess, after his ascension, seated at the right hand of God, ruling and reigning from heaven, right? One day that kingdom will be physical here on earth. He'll rule and reign, all of that Book of Revelation stuff. But it wasn't that, okay, well, Mr. Good Thief, I still got, 2 more hours on the cross before I'm going to die, so you're going to have to wait a couple hours. Then I'm going to be, it's not going to be until Sunday when I'm actually raised to life, so you have to wait until Sunday. But really, even after Sunday, I'm on the earth for 40 days, so, really it's like, 42 days that you have to wait. No. Today you will be with me in paradise, right? And one of the commentaries I read put it this way, right? Even though Jesus had not yet come to his kingdom, he was already giving out a royal pardon, right? He was already forgiving this guy. Right? So anyway, hopefully we'll get out of chapter 23 and into chapter 24, the last chapter of Luke, next week.